Today, a tavern is a quaint name for a neighborhood bar. But taverns played a vital part in America's history. While most historic taverns are long gone, many still remain in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, as private homes, bed and breakfasts, and even museums. To remember is to come off the highway and step into the past.
Taverns by the Wayside was funded in part by grants from the Pennsylvania Public Television Network, F&M Trust, and the Pennsylvania Dutch Candies Foundation.
As Americans, we cherish our young history, a story of manifest destiny, the assumption of our divine imperative to move west. The yearning for what's across the river and over the mountain distinguishes what it means to be an American. Central Pennsylvania's Cumberland County, the intersection of superhighways emanating from New York City, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, carries on a 300-year-old tradition of commerce and travel. Yet we're so used to today's cluttered landscape that we don't notice the remnants of another time. Beyond the endless fast food and motel meccas stands a reminder, the time-worn tavern. Located along early versions of our modern highways, the Tavern by the Wayside was the gas, food, and lodging of yesterday's traveler. But taverns were more than just the truck stops of early America. They were the meeting place of ideas and opinions, the crossroads of cultures, languages, and races, and the hub of early American communities. Taverns sheltered thousands of travelers. Some left behind their thoughts and observations. These letters and diaries bring our past to life.
Traveling on these roads in every direction are wagoners, carrying produce from different shipping ports, particularly Philadelphia and Baltimore. Packers from 1 to 20 horses selling or trucking their wares. Families were moving further back in the country, some with cows, oxen, horses, sheep, and hogs, and all their farming implements. Some with wagons, some with carts, and some on foot. Fortescue Coming, 1807.
Who were these men and women? Where were they going, and what did they see on their various ways? What distant light did they seek in the night's darkness? Pennsylvania was for 100 years the portal to the vast future America that resided beyond the Allegheny front. Early settlers followed trails across the Appalachian Mountains first blazed by Native Americans. The paths through centrally located Cumberland County provided crucial access to points west and south. The main route through the county was the Carlisle Pike, a toll road from Harrisburg through Carlisle to Shippensburg, roughly today's Route 11. Travelers could then continue south to the Shenandoah Valley or push west to the Ohio Valley. In 1794, George Washington led 15,000 troops down the Carlisle Pike on his way to quell the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. Half a century later, a celebrated English visitor traveled this now well-worn turnpike on his tour of America.
Our road wound through the pleasant valley of the Susquehanna. The river, dotted with innumerable green islands, lay upon our right, and on the left, a steep ascent, craggy with broken rock and dark with pine trees. Charles Dickens, 1842.
travelers heading west on the Carlisle Pike began their journey through Cumberland County at the banks of the Susquehanna River. Beyond lay a daunting but beautiful stitch of ascending mountain road. Through these few gaps and down a thin southwesterly valley came Quakers and Mennonites, Catholics and Puritans, Royalists and Patriots, the rich and the poor. There were those looking for adventure and those seeking new lives where it might be different and better. What stood between their present and future was a long and treacherous journey.
Set off for the North Mountain, which we find so bad we are obliged to foot it up, and could compare ourselves to nothing but a parcel of goats. The roads so very bad and so very steep that the horses seem ready to fall backwards. Mary DeWeese, 1787.
Dependent on weather, terrain, and the stamina of animals, a good day's progress was 15 to 20 miles. Commercial coaches covered greater distances by changing horses at determined intervals or stages along the route. By 1825, road improvements made it possible for stagecoaches to make the trip from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh in fewer than 4 days. Although faster, the journey was no more comfortable. In 1837, Count Francesco Arese wrote of his stagecoach trip, "To the charm of the roadway must be added that of the stages, into which are packed several unhappy travelers, who are just as comfortable as anchovies in a keg."
The fatigue in roads permitted us to travel only 10 miles yesterday, when prudence persuaded us to spend the afternoon at Ramsay's Tavern, the best we have entered. Elbridge Gerry, 1813.
Between 1750 and 1840, the first great era of road building in the United States, there were thousands of petitions for tavern licenses in Cumberland County. On Walnut Bottom Road, a 19-mile stretch between Carlisle and Shippensburg, 15 taverns operated in 1825 alone.
In every town, a stranger is astonished to find so many taverns. You need never inquire where there is a tavern, for you may, at a great distance, see the large signs projected out into the highway, apparently half across it. Henry Ellsworth, 1811.
It was in these taverns that travelers sought a meal, a drink, and a night's rest on their arduous journey.
I found a sort of tavern, or whiskey house, where I stopped, having traveled 18 miles. Here I could wet my whistle and procured pork and cucumbers, which tasted well to a man half famished as I was. John May.
Upon arrival, guests were greeted by the welcome sounds of the squeak of husking corn, the dull clatter of kitchenware, and the hiss of the bubbling stew pot. Traveling west from Carlisle, Fortescue Cumming stopped at Cumberland Hall, a popular spot on the Walnut Bottom Road.
At 11 o'clock, I stopped and breakfasted at a large tavern on the right, 7 miles from Carlisle. I got coffee, bread and butter, eggs, and excellent honey in the comb, for which I was charged only 19 cents. My landlord presented me one of the largest and finest apples I had ever seen. It was the produce of his own orchard.
They got us a tolerable supper, better than we expected, and though we believed it to be dirty, yet, being hungry, we ate hearty. The house was so crowded that we could scarcely all get chairs to sit on, and as soon as a seat was vacated, there were 2 or 3 ready to seize it. Joseph Gibbons.
Americans never spent more than 10 minutes at the table, noted a wayfarer from Europe. A meal at a tavern was more a schoolboy's scramble than a social repast. In spite of its volume, it has soon disappeared.
Dear Elizabeth, there was a cockfighting in the house last night, and a great many of the finest young men in town got so intoxicated as to be unable to get home without assistance. Margaret Van Horn Dwight, 1810.
Tavern life revolved around the bar room. Rum and whiskey were cheap and consumed in great quantities. Other common drinks included hard cider, eggnog, and homemade fruit liquors. Men often shared a china bowl of rum punch, passing the bowl from mouth to mouth, with each man's account charged for his share of the total cost. Early Americans drank alcohol at many social gatherings, from weddings, births, and funerals to harvest days and election days, and drinking dominated the tavern trade.
There was never, at any hour of the day, a scarcity of loungers in the spacious bar, or a cessation of the mixing of cool liquors. But they were a merrier people here, and had musical instruments playing to them at night. Charles Dickens.
At 6 p.m., put up at Robert Dowd's Inn. Found good accommodations, but a noisy set of drunken carters kept us awake the greatest part of the night. Mary Ann Reynolds.
The law required tavern keepers to maintain a civil establishment, but the rowdy behavior of drunken wagoners and drovers often turned into violent brawls.
I was very much frightened by a drunken wagoner who came up to me as I stood by the door waiting for a candle. He put his arm round my neck and said something which I was too frightened to hear. Margaret Van Horn Dwight.
Wishing to go to bed as soon as possible, we requested to be shown to our room. We slept very soundly till morning, when we found we had passed the night amongst the whole family, men, women, and children, who had occupied the other beds, and who had come up after we had been asleep. Francis Bailey.
Accommodations for the night were austere. No privacy, little warmth. Travelers slipped off their shoes and slept fully clothed.
We were all obliged to sleep in the same room without curtains or any other screen, and our sheets there were so dirty I felt afraid to sleep in them. Margaret Van Horn Dwight.
Drovers and wagoners transported their own beds, flattened bags filled with chaff or straw. They unrolled them and slept on the bar-room floor by the fire.
40 travelers alighted there, wagoners and packers, and having stretched themselves upon the floor, man and woman promiscuously, covered every possible inch of it, so that the cats in the night, having no place to play upon, displayed their agility on our faces, and awakened some of us in the utmost terror. John Baddeley.
I was initiated into the ancient and no doubt respectable custom of sleeping under the bed. Thomas Lippincott.
Those who made use of the best accommodations on the road, remarked Fortescue Cumming, were country merchants, judges and lawyers attending courts, members of the legislature, and the better class of settlers. The most fashionable tavern in Carlisle, the Sorrel Horse, boasted an elegant ballroom, a handsome dining room, and comfortable lodgings. Like other aspects of American life, taverns reflected the influence of money and status.
I hastened to Foster's Sorrel Horse, to which I had been recommended as the best inn. I asked if I could have a bed that night, and was answered rudely by an elderly man in the bar who I took for the landlord. After he had eyed me with a contemptuous scrutiny, he said that I could not have a room. The house appeared a little would-be stylish, and I was afoot, so not of consequence enough for Mr. Foster. Fortescue coming.
Your host is generally a man of property, the head man of the village, and feels that he confers rather than receives a favor by the accommodation he affords. And rude as his establishment may be, he does not perceive that you have the right to complain. Morris Burbeck.
The tavern keeper bore responsibility for you and your goods, horses, and livestock. While a tavern in town needed access to a stable and granary, the rural tavern operated like a farm, growing crops to feed travelers and their animals, and often included a blacksmith forge and wagon maker's shop.
Ramsay's Tavern is quite a large plantation. His house is neat and handsome, and within the circuit of a mile he has a tannery, flour mill, and some others. More than 20 persons are constantly employed in his service, and one is a blacksmith, for his own and travelers' convenience. He carries on farming very largely, and drives 600 cattle a year to market. Every person is perfectly happy, and seem to watch the opportunity to make others happy. The whole house, and all around it, is characteristic of contentment and happiness. Elbridge Gerry.
In rural areas, taverns supplied multiple functions: post office, store, doctor's office, jail, and courthouse. Because running a tavern often required more work than the tavern keeper and his family were able to manage, they employed help as cooks, waiters, maids, and stable hands. Laborers included hired whites and freed blacks, as well as slaves and white indentured servants. For most, owning a tavern was an unremitting life of barter and debt. At a tavern in Carlisle, a carpenter paid his tab by building a coffin for the tavern keeper's little child. Licenses often changed hands, and many owners were forced to rent or sell off their tavern property.
As in every inland town of Pennsylvania, there is a quantity of taverns and inns, where the people come to talk and drink, morning and evening, as in the cafes of European cities. Théophile Cazenove, 1794.
Not only did travelers carry their belongings, they carried the news of their world, and everywhere they stopped, they were asked to tell. The tavern became a center of the early American community, where local residents gathered to meet visitors and discuss the affairs of the day. Roadways and taverns brought people of all backgrounds face to face with each other and, like so many threads in a cloth, wove Americans together. As in the houses of the great thinkers, it was in the tavern where democracy found its drawing room. Taverns served as meeting sites for political parties, campaign headquarters during elections, and a forum for political debate.
Even two men cannot drink half a gill of whiskey without discussing a point in politics, to the great improvement and edification of the bystanders. Peter Muhlenberg.
On October 1st, 1808, at the Eagle and the Harp in Carlisle, cabinet maker Joseph Logue began arguing politics with tavern keeper Thomas Mitchell. Each fiercely stated his opinion. The dispute escalated when Logue called Mitchell a liar and further defended his point by hitting him with a chisel. We must wonder how much of America was, and perhaps still is, hashed out in a tavern over the contents of a rum barrel. Touring troupes of performers followed the tavern circuit, presenting amusements of all sorts for both guests and locals.
The public are respectfully informed that Mr. Rainey, the justly celebrated performer from Europe, will commence at the large room. He assures the public that in addition to his display of ventriloquism and imitations of all kinds of birds and beasts, he will bring forward a wonderful curiosity so much talked of in London, Edinburgh, and Glasgow.
Crowds gathered to see exhibitions of the exotic and extravagant. At the sign of the Sorrel Horse, a man-made thunderstorm captivated tavern patrons, while a performing elephant entertained spectators at the sign of the Black Bear. Taverns with ballrooms held public dances and offered lessons. Dancing master Mr. Curley came to Carlisle in 1787 and announced that he was opening a school at the Sign of the Turk. Later, he held a candlelight ball to show off his students.
"9 miles from Carlisle, we stopped for dinner. Weekly's Tavern on the Walnut Bottom Road near the foot of the South Mountains, of which we had a beautiful view, and our view was equally pleasing in the interior of the house, where were a number of fine young damsels whose rosy cheeks I considered an indication of a healthy country." John Mellish.
On November 16, 1837, citizens in Cumberland County celebrated the completion of the Cumberland Valley Railroad, the county's first rail line. The railroad allowed passengers and freight to travel through Cumberland County in an amazing 4 hours. Passengers heading east from Cumberland County could arrive in Philadelphia by the end of the same day. Within a few short decades, more people would come through the area on trains than ever traveled the old turnpikes. When the railroad bypassed popular taverns in Cumberland County, it brought about an end to the traditional tavern which had sheltered generations of travelers. In 1964, Fred and Lucille Schreiner bought an old tavern 7 miles west of Carlisle. Known as Mount Rock, taverns had operated on the site for over 100 years. A few days after moving in, Fred and Lucille heard people talking outside and discovered several cars and trucks in their yard. They asked what was going on. "We've always pulled over here," a trucker replied. "This is where everybody's always stopped for a rest." A tradition of 3 centuries continued. Today, the Shriners occasionally invite friends to Mount Rock for a tavern meal, to celebrate and remember those who came before.
I have sometimes thought that the public inn is a receptacle for every wayfaring guest. Where it often happens when one has made his exit, another arrives of quite an opposite character. The respectful proprietor of the hospitable house accommodates himself with amazing facility to the humor of each. Sally Hastings, 1800.
For classroom resources and more information, visit the World Wide Web at witf.org/taverns.html. Taverns by the Wayside was funded in part by grants from the Pennsylvania Public Television Network, F&M Trust, and the Pennsylvania Dutch Candies Foundation. To order a videocassette copy of Taverns by the Wayside, call 1-800-230-4403.